The heretic's fork. The heretic's fork was predominantly used during the late Middle Ages and the Spanish Inquisition. This was a period marked by intense religious fervor and the persecution of those accused of heresy, witchcraft, and other offenses against the Church. This sinister device consists of a collar fitted with two sets of sharp metal prongs, one set placed under the chin and the other against the sternum. When secured around the neck, the apparatus forces the victim to keep their head raised at an uncomfortable angle, leading to excruciating pain and debilitating sleep deprivation. Victims were often interrogated or simply left alone for hours, creating a sense of isolation and hopelessness. If they dared to lower their head due to fatigue or distress, the fork would inflict a gruesome wound, exacerbating the suffering. Sawing. Sawing refers to a gruesome form of torture and execution known as sawing. Historically, this method involved hanging the victim upside down and then slowly sawing their body in half, typically starting from the groin and working upward. The upside-down position increased blood flow to the head, intensifying the victim's pain and confusion and prolonging the suffering. The process was horrifyingly slow, with the use of a saw that could take anywhere from minutes to hours to complete the gruesome task, allowing the condemned to experience not only the physical agony, but also the psychological torment of knowing their fate. The mental and emotional aspect of this type of execution was particularly cruel, as the victim would have ample time to contemplate their choices and the events that led to their brutal end. The Catherine's wheel. This method, also known as the breaking wheel or the execution wheel, is a gruesome form of torture and execution that was used primarily in Europe from antiquity through the Middle Ages and into the 19th century. This method was designed to inflict severe pain and suffering, typically resulting in the breaking of a criminal's bones or bludgeoning them to death. The execution wheel was essentially a large wooden wagon wheel with various designs, sometimes featuring iron spikes along the outer edge. There were several variations of the method, but one common practice involved tying the victim's limbs to the wheel. The executioner would then strike the person's limbs with a hammer or iron bar, systematically breaking their bones in multiple places. After the torture, the wheel would often be displayed publicly, serving as a grim spectacle for onlookers. In some cases, the victim was left on the wheel to suffer from their injuries or to die slowly, sometimes even being left to starve as part of their punishment. Flaying. Flaying is indeed one of the most horrific forms of torture and execution, involving the removal of skin from a living person. Flaying was pretty common in ancient times and used to punish people who were found guilty of crimes. Because the skin is relatively low in major blood vessels, the act of flaying did not necessarily cause immediate, rapid blood loss, allowing victims to remain conscious and endure unbearable agony for an extended period. The punishment could take hours or even days depending on how much skin you had. The process required a significant degree of precision and skill from the executioner. This might include the use of specially designed tools to achieve a smoother removal, with some even utilizing boiling water or other substances to assist in loosening the skin for easier separation from the underlying tissues. Bamboo torture. Bamboo torture is indeed a gruesome and horrifying method that has been described in various historical accounts and folklore, particularly associated with practices in parts of East and South Asia. This method involves forcing a bamboo shoot into the body of a victim, typically through the rectum or a similar opening. Bamboo is known for its rapid growth, and once inserted, it would continue to grow, exerting immense pressure on the body and causing excruciating pain as it penetrated deeper into the victim's flesh. The torture could lead to severe internal injuries, infections, and ultimately death. Blood eagle. Blood eagle method of ritual execution employed by Viking cultures described in Norse literature. This one was a brutal ritual where the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and spread out to resemble wings while the lungs were pulled through the openings, causing a slow, agonizing death. It's short, but it's one of the most brutal ones in my opinion. Pitchcapping. Pitchcapping was a form of torture used by the military against suspected Irish rebels during the period of the 1798 rebellion. This torture involves pouring hot pitch or tar into a conical paper cap and forcing it onto the victim's head. The pitch was allowed to cool and the cap was ripped off, removing skin and tissue from the victim's scalp, scarring him for life. It wasn't usually done with the intention of killing. The risks of subsequent infections and complications made it a dangerous procedure. Rack. The rack was a torture device that was used in many places throughout history. This form of punishment was originally designed for getting a confession, usually from criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war. The device looked like a large ladder, but instead of secure steps, they would actually rotate like a rolling pin. Victims forced to lay on a rectangle-shaped wooden rack that stretched the victims by pulling the arms and legs in opposite directions. It caused incredible pain and could lead to dislocated limbs and torn ligaments. It was mainly used as a method to get information, but it could also be used to tear the victim's limbs out and leave him bleeding to death. Elephant's foot. This punishment, also known as Gunga Rao, was mostly used in Asia, specifically India, and it consisted of killing the victim by crushing him with an elephant. There were two variations of this. If the victim was lucky, his head would be placed on a pedestal and the elephant would crush it, instantly killing him. This wasn't that painful because the victim would die instantly. But the second variation wasn't as forgiving. Some royal members wanted to sit down and enjoy a long show, so they ordered the elephant riders to train the elephants to walk over non-vital parts first, such as the legs and arms. The person would get crushed over and over before the elephant actually walked over his head and killed him. Blowing from a gun. Blowing from a gun was a reported means of execution as long ago as the 16th century and was used until the 20th century. This method of execution, in which the victim is typically tied to the mouth of a cannon, which is then fired, resulting in instant death. Description of what happens was given by an English soldier in the 19th century, and he said that the victim's head goes straight up into the air for about 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly off right and left high up in the air and fall at around a 100-yard distance, while the legs drop to the ground beneath the muzzle of the gun. This low on the list because the victim probably doesn't feel a thing, as his death is instant. Castor oil poop barrels. A method to involve the use of castor oil as a means of torture and coercion, which has been used historically to elicit confessions or as a method of punishment. Castor oil is a strong laxative, and when consumed in large quantities, it can cause severe gastrointestinal distress, leading to uncontrollable diarrhea and cramping. A person would be forced to consume large amounts of castor oil, which would induce extreme discomfort and make it nearly impossible for them to control their bodily functions. Following this, the victim could be placed in a barrel to contain their excretions and further humiliate and punish them. If the individual did not confess or cooperate, there was a risk that they could drown in their own bodily fluids, as the barrel would potentially fill with waste, leading to suffocation or further suffering. Boiling alive. The victim would be lowered into a large container with a boiling liquid, such as oil, gradually and slowly. The first exposed parts would be the extremities, such as fingers and toes, which have lots of nerve endings and cause incredible pain. Then the skin, muscles, and fat softened and liquefied due to the heat, while internal organs and the flesh got boiled from the outside, making this a slow and agonizing process. In another variation, which is thought to be even more painful and long, the victim would be lowered into a normal temperature liquid, which would be gradually heated until it started boiling. Rat's cup. This is one of the most sick punishments in all of human history, and it involves the use of rats. First method attributed to the Roman Emperor Nero involved tying a cup filled with hungry rats to the victim's stomach and then applying heat to the bottom, forcing the rats to burrow through the victim's body to escape. But the second method was much, much worse. It was used under the guidance of the dictator Augusto Pinochet, where he held power from 1976 through 1983. They called it the rectoscope. They would place a tube on a prisoner's back door, then insert a rat inside of the tube. The rat would then begin to burrow its way in. Eventually, the rat would find its way in and begin to move forward to find its way out. Scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is indeed regarded as one of the most horrific and inhumane methods of execution in history. This ancient form of torture and execution is attributed to the Persians. In this method, the condemned individual would be placed between two boats or in a hollowed-out tree trunk, lying on their back with arms and legs sticking out through openings. The executioners would then force-feed the victim a mixture of milk and honey, which would induce intense diarrhea. The intent behind this was not only to cause physical distress, but also to ensure that the individual would attract insects and vermin. The milk and honey mixture would be smeared on the victim's body, further enticing animals like insects, rodents, and birds to feed on the person. This torture could last for days, even weeks, as the victim would be subjected to repeated feedings and the constant assault of insects and animals feeding on their flesh. The combination of being trapped in a confined space, suffering from extreme discomfort, and being eaten alive led to overwhelming suffering. A person surviving 17 days, this person reportedly had his entire face completely covered with wasp, and his flesh was rotting away, filled with swarms of parasites and worms, all while being covered in his own filth.
If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join to my channel KzenaTopic. Have a nice day.